With that, thank you everyone for coming today. Welcome to Accessible Mapping, provided by the Department of Disabilities Assistive Technology Program, the IT Accessibility Initiative. My name is Stephen. I am the director of the initiative. Pleasure to talk with you all today. Today's webinar is mostly focused on if you're considering adding a map to your website, if you're a content manager, you already have one, or if you are a communication staff or IT staff for your department or company or what have you, and is looking into potentially using maps. We have a hand, please. Yes. Oh, hold on. You should be able to unmute if you need to. Or you can just put your question in chat. Oh, okay. All right. If there are no questions, or if there's an issue, please let me know. Hopefully, everything appears to be good on my end. But if there's an issue with hearing me or seeing the screen, let me know. In the meantime, just the usual housekeeping items. Captions are available today. You should be able to turn them on from the closed captioning button on your menu ribbon. Okay, you're good. Great. Thank you. This webinar is being recorded and will be shared later in the week with you all, along with the slide deck today. I apologize for not getting out in advance. Usually we do so, and I missed it this time. So we'll make sure to get you all a copy as soon as the recording is available to us. But as I was mentioning, this session is not going to go really into like any of the technical details of making a map or data analysis or anything like that. Like this is very focused on just if you're going to put a map on your web page, what considerations do you need to have to make sure that you're being either compliant with state law or that you're being accessible as possible. So if you have questions, please put them in chat and Q&A. I will try and answer them as we go along. Or hopefully answer them relevant. There will be a pause in between discussion and the actual demonstration that will hopefully I can address some of those questions then. With that, let's go ahead and get started. So just a quick reminder about the basics of web accessibility. These are things that are universal. So any website, document, electronic document, sorry, software, web application, what have you, needs to follow these in order to have some basic level or basic foundation of accessibility. So you need to have alternate text. So images need to be described. Any non-text content probably should have a text equivalent, such as like audio only or something. So there's a transcript available to people, that kind of thing. Keyboard access, that you're able to move around a web page using just the keyboard. Also really important for a lot of assistive technology because it uses that same basis. Screen readers use a keyboard as well. The voice control uses a lot of the same control schemes, telling things to click or to press that link. And if it's not a link, it's a button that will cause an issue there. So that kind of thing of making sure everything works correctly without the mouse. Headings and navigation so that the site is organized and we have ways to move around the website quickly and efficiently. We don't have to move through every single element to get to the last one, which is the one we need. We're able to jump to the section that we want. Reading order so that things operate and read in the way we should intuitively understand. So when you open, the example I like to point to is a mobile navigation menu. When you press that button, the menu opens. You should be able to move to those items. And then if the menu closes, you should be able to move past it without having to read those items. Or there isn't things in between the button and the menu. That tends to be a problem too. Field labels. So a label or field that you put data in, like your search bar or something, actually tells AT or assistive technology, sorry, I should say that, what that form field is asking for. So not just visually, we can see search, that programmatically it's there too. So a screen reader will tell the user search input field. and they're able to know, okay, I need to put this data in here, or first name or last name or address, anything like that. And then link descriptions, so making sure users understand what they're going to click and what should happen when they do. Examples on screen here. The first one in the middle is inspecting an actual mapping application. It's a lot of code, and it can be a little messy to look at, but the highlighted part is what I'm most pointing out here, which is a button. And it has ARIA label equals tables. So this will communicate to screen readers that this button is to enable tables. Without that label, because the button uses an icon inside of it, and that's what users see is a little like table icon. Screen reader is not going to know what that means because that's not a standard language character. So it wouldn't be able to tell a user what the button does without that label. So that's why that's so important. The second example is actually from Word, and that is when you're formatting a picture, there's a place to enter alternate text. If you're using a content management system like WordPress or something, you'll probably see something very similar to this, either in properties or something like that for an image, where you can add that alt text. So you can add that description there. In this case, the example was talking about how to format a shape, and the description of this image says the corner arrow for format shape is found after the picture layout option in the second group on the format ribbon. So the actual picture that went along with this had that corner arrow highlighted with like a box outline. So that's the kind of thing that we're looking at here. So how does all of this apply to mapping applications? Because we're dealing with a very complex visual thing. How do we communicate all of that non-visually? And it is a challenge. I won't argue that. A lot of what we're looking more at is how can we make sure this information is available to users who can't use it visually, or for people who have color blindness and aren't able to distinguish certain parts of the map. Or how can we even get, like in the case of Google Maps, where we're looking for directions, how do we get them the directions from point A to point B in a way that they can read it without having to use the map? Or if they can use the map, how can we make it easier for them if they need to magnify it to 500%? That's the kind of thing that we're thinking about here today. I'm mostly going to talk about Google Maps and Esri, the Esri suite of products. Those are the two I'm most familiar with, but a lot of these concepts will apply to any other mapping application or tool that you use, because again, we're really just talking about the basic things to think about here, or things you might take to your developer or your team and say, hey, what are we doing about this? I'm not going to go into technical detail if I can avoid it. I will say Google Maps is a bit more closed off. Like, it comes as a package. You can't really do anything with it. But they've done a lot to make it very accessible, which is great. Esri has a lot of tools for you and your developers to make it accessible, but there's a lot of detail you can go into and a lot of nitty gritty that can happen. So I'm going to go through kind of like just the basic considerations and some of the things that they offer you that Google Maps does not have. So here are your general rules of thumb when you're working with maps. The first thing to think about is, what are you conveying through this map? You probably have already thought of this because there's a certain kind of data you want to show or directions or what have you, but why are you choosing this? Why are you choosing this method? Is it a possibility to use an alternative like a table? If you're working with a data set, you probably are already working with a table, because in the case of like Esri, you upload that table and it turns it into data points on a map. Well, that table, if you just put it on your website after making it accessible, which doesn't take too much effort, you now have an alternative. Do you really need a map then? So just think of things like that. There's nothing wrong with adding a map. It's just you want to make sure that what you're conveying through this is you have a direct purpose for using it, and that what are some ways you might need to think about presenting that information in another manner. Second rule is to keep it simple. Remove extraneous info. Maps can communicate a lot to us, especially in the case of online maps, where you can have, you know, 400 different types of data shown on it, but that's a lot to look at. So giving people a way to find just specific types of data or a way to filter things out is going to be really necessary. And going above like 4 or 5 different types will start confusing users with either cognitive disabilities or just regular end users. Or non-disabled users who are just getting overwhelmed because there's so much information here. So we want to try and keep things simple, really get to the point of what you're trying to show them. Third is to check your color contrast, mostly for your text and your symbols, so your legend and anything that's appearing on the map. Maps themselves are very visually complex, so color contrast for them is very tricky. A lot of what we're going to be concerned with, though, is the actual labels. So like on the city map from Google Maps from before on Baltimore, the text of Baltimore and then its surrounding areas like Columbia or Dundalk or any of the other local towns, making sure that text is very visible against the background. Whereas the extra detail on the map, that can be more or less hand waved. Symbols as well, just because that's communicating very important information. That's the reason you're looking at this map. It also applies to the visual focus indicator, which is that outline that moves around that tells you where you are when you're navigating by keyboard. I'll show you guys that later on. And then you want to use real text when possible. This can be very important with maps because a lot of these maps will have that data like those city names and such as part of the background layer, and screen readers and other AT can't use that. They can't read that to users. Google has done something very clever where they've made quadrants that will read out very important landmarks, which is an excellent way to get around this, but that's something they've done. Other platforms, you're going to need to try and have that information on another layer in text, or you're going to have it needed in like the little pop-up bubbles on a flag or that kind of thing. But whenever possible, whenever it gives you the option, use text instead of another option, because that's the easiest method for a lot of these assistive technologies or for users to access. And then finally, check your tab order. Very simple. You're just really pressing tab and shift tab. You might be using arrow keys and enter in order to move around parts of it too. Like if you're in a table or a menu, you might be using arrow keys. Enter is going to be how you click on things, but you want to make sure that you can reach these buttons and that they go in the order that you kind of intend users to get to them. This will be easier to understand when I demonstrate it, but the idea is that, if I go to the search bar and I search for something, it should move me down to that search menu, and I should be able to move through that search list of results with just my arrow keys and select the website for the third option with tab and enter, so that I don't have to move through all of the rest of the map in order to get directions to my office here in northern Baltimore. So let's start with color contrast. Bit more about that. So color contrast, as I mentioned before, is kind of complicated in terms of mapping because there's a lot of information that's communicated by color. So rather than say, like we do for websites where, text must have this, everything must have this ratio, what we're going to be concerned about is that those text labels, so the labels for your data, against the background, and then presenting people with options. That's one of the tools that Esri has that is really nice, is that they have different base maps, they call them, and they have a couple different high contrast ones. So in the example on screen here, the low contrast is their default map. Now, if you're looking at it and you don't have color blindness or anything like that, you can see how there's shadows for like the mountain ranges, or like the forest areas or wooded areas. You can kind of see topography. We lose that in the high contrast example. But if you're looking at like the roads and the city names and such in low contrast, they're a bit harder to distinguish versus the high contrast. Esri has the ability for the user on their end to select the base map that works for them. And they have a couple different high contrast ones. This is just one example. They have ones for different types of color blindness, for like red, green, or blue, yellow, the 2 or 3 most prominent types. So they have other options available, just so you are aware. But the nice thing about it in that high contrast one is all of the roads are now highlighted and stand out more from the base map. All of the text for each of the city locations or building locations is bolder text, but has a white outline to help, again, distinguish it from the background, that kind of thing. So Esri has these tools available. You just kind of need to build in with it. Google Maps doesn't quite have that. Unfortunately, Google Maps doesn't really have any tools for color contrast at this time. So one of our main ways to get around that is by using color filters or Chrome extension or something to help change the color scheme of the web page, and that can get around it. But we're a bit more limited in that regard. But this is a consideration to have of what options can I offer my users to have this contrast availability. So if you're in the state and you're going to the Department of IT to get a map built in Esri, make sure that you get the options for the other contrast maps enabled, because that helps take care of a lot of problems. As I mentioned, we do lose a little information, like we lose that topography and such. So, there is a bit of a give and take, and that's why I want to make sure instead of choosing one and making all users use it, we instead offer options. There is a caveat to this. If your data is specifically color oriented, such as a heat indexed, which uses a defined color schema to show those data points, that isn't beholden to color contrast, but then we need to think about another way to present that information, and we'll talk about that more later. Now, simplicity and function. As I said, there's a lot you can do with these tools. They're very powerful. So what we need to concern ourselves with is, at what point are users going to get overwhelmed, and how can we avoid that? So the simple way, or the starting point, is, again, have that accessible base map, have that available, especially if it's not really relevant to your data. Like if you're showing locations of things, having that topography information underneath might not be a good choice, because that adds a visual complexity that, some users might not be bothered. Other users might have trouble distinguishing things. And then another subset of users is going to have a lot of trouble distinguishing where something is in relation to another, because there's other information being presented to them. They can't focus on the one part they need. So having your default map, again, having options, but your default might be, like in the example here, just a default gray that has the borders of the state and nothing else. We want to avoid stylizing text. This usually isn't a problem, but we still need to mention it in case you are changing fonts. You do want your font to be a very default font, Arial, Times New Roman, that kind of thing. Sans serif usually is a bit better, but we don't want to change it a lot. So default with, usually a black with maybe a white outline to help distinguish it. Depending on what other colors you're using, you might want to change those, but choose one and stick with it. Don't try to have multiple types. You do want to limit the use of your patterns. So when you are putting in your data and you're presenting it, and you have different types of things in your legend, you want to limit your options to 4 to 5, maximum 6 to 7, as you see on that last bullet point, because more than that, and the users can't keep it in their heads. Average memory, short-term memory, 7 to 9, I believe, is still the number. But those with disabilities might have less, they might have more, but and other users, same thing. But those with low vision and such might have trouble distinguishing a lot of different patterns, especially if they start overlapping or stacking. because you're showing, crossover of data, which important information, but if you have a crosshatch overlapping with a horizontal line or something, that's going to uh, not be distinguishable to them. So that's why we want to try and limit it or have ways to filter it. Again, nice thing about like Esri and Google is those filtering options are available to you. So you can select, I want to show just this type of information, or select just this legend item and just show me these icons. So just keep that in mind, is if you're showing like pattern scales or something, only have a couple, try to keep it low, and try to avoid stacking them if able, or have a way to remove that stacking if needed. So the example on here is a map that just shows one type of data. I believe it's a type of farm, um, type and locations throughout the state. So it's just one type of data. So that's why it's all these little blue dots throughout the state. The nice thing with this is that it's only showing us that information, so where they are. Now, there are tools in there, if we were in the actual application, that show you a list of all of those. And you can pull out like tools to figure out, distance from it to another one or distance from it to another point. But all those tools are at our discretion. So when we're just looking at this, it's a bit simpler to understand. So the more we can limit that, the better. Now, navigation, actually moving through the application, is where things start getting a little complicated. The main thing to keep in mind is that we want ways for users to skip to parts of it. So headings, landmarks, and shortcuts. All three of these are ways that a lot of assistive technology will move around a web page quickly and easily. So we need to make sure that those are there. So having a heading or a landmark for your search list, your region, having one for the legend, having one for the map itself, having one maybe for a data table pull up or something. All those are really useful because they give us a way to jump to those without having to interact with everything else in between and get to the part that we want to use. Making sure that there's a logical flow to these and to the control schemes. So when I get to the control area, I move to the search bar, and then from the search bar, I immediately move to the results of my search. I don't have to move through all the zoom buttons on the map. I don't have to move through other parts of the map. I don't have to move through the legend. It will just take me to the next part. So making sure that we're keeping that in mind, and that's where we need to enforce keyboard access, because a lot of the times with these applications, because they're so complex and are broken into these regions, we need to make sure that every oh, okay. May I just had an internet outage. I apologize. There we go. Okay. Hello, everyone. Apologies for that. Looks like we just had a little internet blip there. So hopefully we didn't lose too much. If it happens again, I might do a separate recording and share that out afterwards, but let us get back to it. I hope I didn't miss anything. There we go. So hopefully I was still talking about navigation when we left off, and I will try and pick that up here again. If for whatever reason we're missing a part, like I said, let me know, and I will try and get people that information in another manner. So I'm gonna go back over logical flow because I think that's where I left off. Hopefully, let me know if it was further back or something. And we'll just go from there and make the best of it. Apologies. Anyway, so logical flow, enforcing keyboard access, making sure that, again, we're not having to go through other parts of the menu or such to get to things that are relevant. So when I move to a flag on the map and I click it and I move up into the tooltip, that it's there. And we need to usually enforce keyboard access for those things because they might not have it by default. So that tooltip, we need to make sure users can get to it. Otherwise, if they're moving through all the different flags before they can get to that tooltip, they might lose the one that they were looking for. They might be confused to which one it applies to. And it's also just not intuitive, especially for a keyboard only user who has clicked it and now can't get to it, and they're going to get frustrated and annoyed. So making sure things move, or that keyboard access or other type of control scheme is able to move intuitively how we kind of expect people to. Um, when possible, we want to skip unnecessary elements. The background, the base map that you're using is a good example of this. In some cases, because those quadrants are there and they're like constantly changing and loading, sometimes a keyboard or a screen reader can get to those and read them out. And there isn't much we can do on the back end, to my knowledge, to stop that because of the way it works. But if we have ways to skip that, like a skip to content link or a skip to data link, those kind of things at the start help us jump past those things and not have to interact with them. Um, or if we get lost, we can go back to the start, click that link, and get back to where we need to go. So giving people options to get to the regions they need to be in. And then finally, provide labels and accessible tooltips, making sure every button tells the user what it's going to do. Icons can communicate that visually, but they don't work for a lot of assistive technology. Or we want to make sure that the tooltips, when you hover over it, that tell us what the button does, also work on focus for like a keyboard or for low vision users or screen readers, so that those also read to the user, so they always know what the button will do when they press it, or what this link will do if it goes somewhere else outside of the application, that they know that's going to happen. Usually this is things like title. When you're in the content management system, it'll ask for a title or description or label. Any of those, as long as they're filled out and they tell us that information and they match what you're intending visually, or you say visually, that's good enough. But keep that in mind when you're working with your developer. Now, accessible alternatives is really the meat of this presentation, is because, as I mentioned, maps are difficult to make accessible because they're A, inherently visual, B, they're complex. So sometimes it just comes down to, we need to have an alternative method for users to get this information. As I mentioned, Google Maps and Esri have done quite a bit in order to make their products accessible, and they're doing pretty well, in my opinion. But I would say for most of them, a novice screen reader user is going to struggle. Someone with a cognitive disability might struggle. Someone with a physical disability might also struggle a bit too. So we need to make sure that they have other ways to get to the information if they get too frustrated. So having something like a list where you just present that information, very simple, easy to add. A lot of these will also have built-in search functionality. If you're using the application to build that list, you can also put that list elsewhere on your website and make sure just users have a link to it to get to it easily. Or maybe on your web page, present the list first and then say, if you want to look at it on the map, click this link. Either of those options are acceptable. It's just making sure that we have that alternative available. Tables is the second way I would recommend having an alternative. Tables are great for data. They can be made accessible fairly easily. They can be, they're a bit more complicated than a list. But the nice thing about them is that by providing that heading row and the column, if possible and needed, it maintains the data references. So the example on screen here is a simple example table with the building, street, city, state, and zip code columns. And then we have a first column, or the row label is the main office, secondary, IT desk, and state park. So if I'm looking for the zip code of the IT desk and I go to that cell with a screen reader, it's going to read 2701 zip code IT desk, because if it's set up properly, it will read the cell's contents and then it'll read the labels for the column and the row if there is one. So I don't have to go back up to the top to make sure I'm in the right column. I don't have to go to the left to make sure I'm in the right row. It does that for me. Saves a lot of time and effort. Um, this is a very good way for information to be presented to users in an accessible manner. And usually tables are pretty easy to, or you have to make it for like Esri products and such, um, because you're going to be using that table to put your data set together and label it correctly so Esri can interpret it and make a map out of it. Since you've already made that table, you just need to make a few adjustments and boom, you have an accessible alternative. Not much work. So keep this in mind, and you're probably going to have to do this, but they should not take you much extra effort, if any. The last thing before we get into the demonstration is how to route users to these options, because we want to make it, again, easy for users to get to these. Having a bypass link at the start within the first couple links, if you're using just a keyboard and you go to a website, a good number of these should have it, or you press tab, and then you might have to press shift tab back. The very first link should be like a skip to content link that appears. If you click that, it would send you down into the main region and skip like the navigation menu and such. Same idea here. It's just we might have more than one. We might have one to skip to the controls, skip to search bar, skip to data, skip to table, any of those options. You might have all of them. All of those are great because it gives ways users to either get to the part that they want / need, or if they get lost or stuck somewhere, they can just go back to the top, get to that link again, and come back to where they want it to be. So it makes things easier for users, gives them the way to get around the site more efficiently. We do want to organize our reading order, if possible, to put accessible information first. A lot of these applications, there's only so much we can do, especially on our end versus a developer's end. But we want to make sure that when we're asking them for things that we say, can we have the list region before the map rather than vice versa? So the list might be on the left side, or if it's on the right side, focus moves to it before it goes to the map, that kind of thing. Think about how that information is being presented. Like, am I going to all the flags on the map first? Well, I don't want to have to scroll through all of those in order to get to the search bar. So either have that skip link or go to the search bar before you get to the flags, that kind of thing. See what your options are and think about what is going to be your user's workflow and try to make it easier on them. Nice thing to do, especially if your application has its own custom shortcuts, is to provide a dialog or an alert on page load that explains these. So when you first go to the map, sometimes you'll see this on like some of the state maps. It'll give you a dialog explaining what the map does, what it shows you. This is a great place to also give people that information about, here's extra shortcuts that we have. Like if you press, say, Control plus Alt plus S, it'll take you to the search bar. That's excellent, but you need to communicate that to users and do it immediately so that they don't have to try and find that information or they do it accidentally. We do also need to add extra buttons for these tools on the menu. Usually the main menu, they can be in other places depending on if it's relevant. But a help button, always good to have, not just for explaining things, but also how to use it. Bring up that dialogue again, bring up that shortcut list, anything like that. But give people ways to get to these tools and make sure that they're aware of them. So the example on screen here is that when you start on the page, I want to just go to the data table because I'm using a screen reader and that map is a pain. So I'm going to find the skip to data link. So that's the first thing. Great. I'm going to click that. It takes me immediately to the table. I'm where I want to be because I know I can use this, especially if it has filtering options like some tools have. Because I can click those, click those columns. I can find the information, look and start scrolling through, and I'm happy. I don't have to worry about anything. You have a happy customer who's going to keep using your product. We're all good. So now I'd like to talk through these things and actually demonstrate them to you. I'm not going to be using a screen reader today. I'm just going to be using the keyboard to show what I'm doing about. But I'm going to start with Esri, and I'm going to move to Google Maps. and talk a little bit about contrast and text, navigational challenges that we might face, and some other issues. If anyone has questions at this point, please feel free to put them in chat and Q&A. I saw another warning about internet instability, so I hope I'm still coming through. If I review the recording and I find it to be problematic, I will redo it and send out the new recording. So it might be another week or so before you get it. I apologize. Sometimes these things happen. It's the dangers of technology in this era. So with that, let me move to here. Let me make sure this screen is sharing. It is good. Okay. So this is Esri's Designing Web Maps for Accessibility example. This is publicly available. Great tool for us. I'm going to move my camera out of the way. There we go. And I'm just going to be using keyboard. So I'm using my tab key in order to move around. If you notice in the top right, and I'm pointing at it, there is a previous and next button. And when I press tab, there's now a new outline around what I'm currently at. So previous button, next button. That outline is what I'm referring to as the visual focus indicator. So that tells me as a keyboard user where I'm at. Otherwise, if I don't see anything like that and I don't see any changes in content or context, I don't know where I am or what I'm clicking. So that's why that's important. Browsers do have this by default sometimes, but it's usually for just links. So for buttons and such, we need to make sure that something there. And it's not going, it might not match your color scheme. It might blend in or it might not be contrast compliant. And so that's why we need to pay a lot of attention to it. So in this case, if you see now it's on the drop down for consider high contrast base maps. If I go to working with enhanced contrast base maps link, that one has an outline. That's the kind of thing I'm looking for. So with these base maps, the example on screen here, they have kind of just a general geography map here. But they've done a couple of things here that are really useful. So the first off is they have different color schemes for different items. So like the wooded forest areas are like a green with kind of a squiggle slash camo pattern. Water has a blue color, but also has a wavy line texture to it. These ranges areas are kind of a purplish color with a crosshatch or diamond shapes. And then if we move over a little bit, I'm going to cheat and use my mouse here. The Indian reservation is a brownish color with larger diamonds than the ranges. So we have, and then the city population areas are this kind of darker yellow that's just flat. So we have color that stands out from each other really well. But then we also have textures available to us. And then our text on the screen, if I can zoom in, let me use the keyboard actually, and practice what I preach. If I zoom in, the text, if you're reading it, is black with a white outline, so it helps it stand out better from everything else. Very useful. Roads are that dark red outline, so we can tell by the shape what it is, and then the border between the countries, since that's the border between California and Mexico, has that very dark line with the yellow outline. So very easily distinguishable elements from each other. There are other kind of base maps available, as you can see in the top right there. If I go to that, that changes it to a different base map. So this is like a darker contrast for someone who's using, who needs a different color scheme instead of red, green or whatever. So there's other options available to users to give them ways to easily distinguishable this information. So they have light and dark mode, that kind of thing. So let me get back to the next button and press that. So symbol colors and styles. So this is a bit more about your data presentation, and hopefully it's loading correctly. There it is. There we go. Okay. So what they've done here is their data points for total population from uh, uh, 0 to 0.04 use a color scheme of yellow to purple. Pretty easily distinguishable, but when you start blending those colors, maybe there's an issue. But they've also connected it to size. So they have 0 at the smallest dot, and then highest population per area is a large dot. So if I move to LA, and then if I go here, nope, and I think I need to get, there we go. And I scroll up using my arrow keys to LA. I can zoom in and I can kind of tell where that population is roughly, downtown LA, obviously the highest population by area, but there's multiple symbols there. So there's a way for us to communicate with color, but also communicate with another medium, in this case, symbolism. Same kind of idea we were doing with the contrast maps where you have texture added to it. Depending on what data you're showing, you might have to do this in different ways. If you're showing multiple data points, in which case just making sure that it's very easily distinguishable, and then maybe having a way to filter different types of data from each other. Now, areas of interest. This is a tool that Esri has, which can be very useful. They have what they call layer effects, and it's kind of the same idea as the filters that we were talking about. If I go to here, this bar that's dividing the map, if you look at the left side, it's kind of darker up by LA. I can move it left to right. And it's changing kind of the contrast there. But the nice thing about it too is if I scroll past this data, which is the same data as before, that population, now with this filter they've added, that data, it's focused in on that area. If you look at how the desert state wilderness, Anza Borrego, is also in that highlighted area, it helps it pop out to us. So all that text is much easier to read. The data pops out higher, and they've added more effects to the points of data so that they're easier to see. So again, offering people options. The nice thing about it is that desert state wilderness, initially, when I was first looking at this before using it today, I didn't quite see those data points there. But when I moved the filter over it, now I see them. So I don't have a color blindness or another visual disability. And for me, that was more useful. That was easier to see. So that's the thing to keep in mind, is that it's not just those with disabilities, it can be for everyone, because making all of this easier to use and easier to understand is just general good practice and making things better. That's the whole kind of point of accessibility, is making sure everyone can get to it and people have the tools that they need, or that what we're building works with the tools they already have. You don't need to build a screen reader into your software. You just need to make sure your software works with their screen reader. Now, pop-ups for clarity here. What they've done is, again, giving us a way to format the pop-ups. It's taking a bit to load. But what they've done here is they have a pop-up that gives us information if it loads here. There we go. That gives additional information on the census. So in this case, I can focus it so that black outline around this box tells me I'm in it, so that my arrow keys control its scroll bar versus the map or the whole web page. So I can scroll down and see the bottom of this chart that says male and female population counts. But here's this additional information that's available. But if I want to, I can uh, press the zoom in key to pull me into where that county is. In this case, the harbor of San Diego. I can minimize it, so it's out of my way if I want to look at the map directly, and it's in my way. I can attach it to this point if I'm not quite sure where it's going to. or I can just get rid of it entirely, and so it's gone. And I still have yet to figure out how to get it back. So I hope you got the idea because I was still pushing buttons before and I couldn't figure it out. But that's the kind of thing I'm talking about, is that they give you options to use these pop-ups. And they go into it with more detail on their blog post about it. And this is linked in the presentation I was sending to you guys. So you should be able to get access to this and play around with it. Um, but they give you options to work with the pop-ups or your lists and such to make them easier for users. A lot of the times you'll have buttons to get to your legend or your list or something, and then you can close them to get them out of the way. So giving people those tools rather than just forcing it on them and having it open all the time is probably a good idea. And then finally is the alternative formats. So in this case, what a lot of Esri products do is they give you a table view. And it's usually available from either a button, either on the side or a pull down on the bottom, or in some cases, it's a whole link at the top that says table view. I can press this and it will pull up a table for me once it loads. And this is inside the Esri product. So I don't have to host this on another web page. I don't have to build a whole new one. I can take that data set I've put into Esri and it will turn it into this table for me. And it gives me a pretty accessible alternative if I'm struggling with the map. So inside here, I can close it, get rid of it. I can export it as an Excel file from the more options button here. Um, uh, might have frozen on me. It froze on me. Okay, we're good. Sorry about that. So I can press that. There we go. So I can, change the data. I can export to CSV. I can show high columns if I want. But now I can move through the table and I can go by column. And if I want to say, what sense or what state am I talking about? Oops. I want to go to state and I want to, hold on. There we go. I want to sort by descending. Oops. There we go. Got it. So now I have it sorted by state and descending. So now it's starting with Wyoming instead of Hawaii was at the start there. And I can then move into a different column, sort by that. I can move to the next row. Now, this is a bit more complicated because as a table and a lot of functionality they've added, like when you see it like highlight a different color, that's me pressing either escape to change what I'm doing or to get out, because once I've pressed into it once, it kind of sticks there. So in this case, like it was trying to say, oh, do you want to do, sort by this, or do you want to highlight this, whatever. And I was like, no, I want to move to the next row. So I'm pressing escape. So it's a bit more complicated to use, but since I know how to use it, that's fine. And that's what I'm getting at is now I can, sort, I've gone through the state. Now I can go, okay, what's the population for this section here? Or, in this case, they have checkboxes here if I want to highlight a row or something or pull that data out. So there's a lot of tools in here for me to use, but they're completely keyboard accessible. I can sort by any of those functions there. I can move through the whole table. I can do that with a screen reader too. If I was doing voice control, I could say scroll down here and it would do the same thing. So it gives me a lot of alternatives available here. So now with the last 10 minutes, I'm going to look at Google Maps and see a couple things that they've done. Now, I will say, again, one of the challenges there was the fact that, yeah, it's a bit more complicated to use. So a novice user is going to struggle. And that's where we might have to present the information either in a list or in a much simpler way. But this is where, we start getting into more in-depth discussions. So those of you at state agencies who have questions about this, reach out. I'd be happy to help. Those of you who are not, I'd be happy to direct you to what resources I can, or give you some general advice about ideas. But a lot of the times we're doing the best we can here with a challenging medium. So Google Maps, uh, they start you off by the search function, which is excellent. Great. They don't have a skip to content link, but what they do is what I'm showing on here, which is that quadrants thing I was mentioning, where I can control the map with my keyboard. And the nice thing is that it gives me uh, kind of major landmarks in that area, such as, okay, this is Montebello, this is that area, Herring Run Park, um, Mayfield, Little, which I think is a grocery store. But I can use the left arrow to move to the next quadrant. So there's the Weinberg Y is there. There's Penn Lucy, there's Waverly, there's Sherwood Gardens. Can move over one. There's Johns Hopkins University. There's Hamden. There's Roosevelt Park, Wyman Park. I can go down here to Druid Heights. I can move around the map with just using my arrow keys, and it tells me some major parts of that. So I can go to Johns Hopkins here, and then with those numbers corresponding in that pop-up there. And the nice thing too, I should also mention, Screen Reader will read all of this to us. So Screen Reader can move around the map the same way, and will read all of these options to us here. So let's say I want to look at Johns Hopkins University. So I can either press 4 or 5 on my keyboard, and it pulls it up into my search results. And it will pull up, hopefully it'll load, there we go. It will pull up Google's little information blurb about them. And then it will move my focus automatically back up to here. So I can move through my search results and then move through here, the results here, and then I can start moving through their information blurb about this. It should have skipped all those filters, but for some reason it didn't. I might have messed up, but in either event, I can get to this fairly easily. And now I'm able to get either directions to Johns Hopkins, or I can send this link to somewhere else if I need to send it to them. I can get more information about it. I can copy their address. I can open their website from here, or I can just copy it if I needed to grab it for whatever reason. Easy to get to, easy to move about. Now, as I mentioned, Google Maps also has these filters. So I can pull out just specific types of information that does filter the results that you saw in the quadrant view as I'm moving around, which is very useful. Last thing with Google Maps, though, is they do have some additional views. I have to move past everything here. You know what? It's going to be easier if I skip here because I'm running out of time. So we do that. And then if I go to here, move my camera. There we go. And I want to get to the layers. Here we go. All right. So the layers button, here's where I can kind of change the map's look. You probably have already done this before on your own, but you can change, check terrain, you can check traffic, transit locations, biking things. There's a bunch of other options here. Street view, air quality, travel time measure. There are some other views. They don't have a color contrast map or a high contrast map or anything like that, but you might be able to see if one of these other views work better for you, or if there's information you want, like transit hubs, where are these, that kind of thing. This is kind of something you just need to play around with, see what works best if you're having trouble with it. You are limited. So that is one of the challenges of using Google Maps, is we can't do much more for those with color blindness and such. We can use the built-in color filters from Microsoft or in Apple. If you go to your ease of access center or your accessibility center, there's color filters that put a filter over your entire screen. Those might help. There are some Chrome extensions out there that can change this to like a dark mode or something. That might help. You're going to have to experiment to see what works in those cases. So just be aware that that might be a challenge. And again, have that alternative list out. Have a link to if you're putting like a Google map on your web page for directions to your site, make sure that it opens with the direction things already open so that they can just put in their address and they get that list. When we were doing Johns Hopkins earlier, um, if I open up directions, m- try to have it open in this thing. Google kind of tries to steer you to this anyway with those kinds of links. Just make sure you use that function because it's easier for a user to deal with this rather than trying to have to find it and do it themselves. So again, just making it easier for our consumers to move about the site. With that, that is kind of everything I wanted to cover. We have about 5 minutes left. If people have questions, you can feel free to put them in chat or in Q&A. Um, if you, again, are at all interested in more information, um, you can contact myself or our new team member who started today, Dan. You'll all meet him hopefully next month. Uh, you can contact both of us at our email, mdod.nva@maryland.gov. You can check out our website. We have some more information about this, and our state kind of guidelines slash advice is posted there on our website. You can also go to the Minnesota IT Services, who um, kind of led the charge on this, and I've talked a lot with them. I've learned quite a bit from them, so they're an excellent resource, especially for this. Esri has their own accessibility office. They've been doing a lot of work. They've been good people to work with too. So if you have a question about Esri specifically, reach out to them for either learning what they're doing or if you're having trouble with something. Um, Great resource there. And then finally, Google Maps has their own support articles for this and how to use Google Maps with the screen reader, because there's some additional shortcuts and such I did not show today that might be helpful. So your checklist for maps is keep it simple, make sure you offer alternatives, check your color scheme of your data, and then finally test it with your keyboard, make sure you can do everything. I'm glad this was helpful. Thank you. Thank you for attending. All right, I'm not seeing any other questions, so I'm going to stop the recording now. I will hang up or hang on for a couple minutes just in case there is any last minute things, and we'll just end right at 2 o'clock.